Hey guys, welcome back to Lawrence County High School for a whole new day of exciting discussion on economics topics coming at you from Economics 3, which is our third installment of our econ lessons here. Today we go off on another path here and we're going to talk about integration. So when we look at integration, we're going to see that there's basically two types of integration that economists worry about. The first one is something called horizontal integration. So we got to try and figure out which way is horizontal. Is this horizontal or is this horizontal? And actually, I don't really know the good rule to tell you on except for, I guess, horizon. Think about the horizon when you look out there at it. The horizon is this way and you see the sun come up over the horizon. So we're talking about a line this way. In economics, horizontal integration is this. It's the merger of a company with another company that produces a similar good or service. Merger means that they join together. So whenever a company buys out another company that produces sort of the same thing they're producing, that can be horizontal integration. So here's some examples. Let's talk about a company called The Gap. How many of you know what The Gap is, if you've ever heard of The Gap? The Gap is basically a place to go to buy clothing. The Gap owns the following stores. They own a set of stores called the Banana Republic. The Gap also owns a set of stores called The Gap. There used to be one in the Huntington Mall. I don't know where the closest one is now. The Gap also owns a store called Old Navy, which I'm sure probably most of you have heard of. So let's think about this for a second. This corporation called The Gap owns all three of these stores. And really what they've done is they're targeting different groups of people. If you've ever gone to Banana Republic, that's a fairly expensive store. And when you go there to buy clothing, you're going to pay quite a bit of money for it. If you go to The Gap, that's sort of a middle of the road price store. Nothing super cheap, but it's also not super high like Banana Republic. Then I guess most of us have been in Old Navy. And Old Navy, you can go buy a pair of jeans for $12. So you can get cheaper clothing there. But let's think about what The Gap has done. They're targeting all the different types of people who want to purchase clothing, which is pretty smart, but one company owns them all. I went to an econ training, just as an aside, several years ago, and one of the guys who came and presented to us was he used to buy massive amounts of clothing to sell to retail stores. And he told us the story that like he would go purchase these, like many cases of, let's say, khaki pants from this producer in Indonesia. They would take them back to the retailers and sell them. And what the retailers would do was, let's say that The Gap bought them, they would take those pants and they would brand some of them Banana Republic and they would sell them for $100. Then they would brand some of them Gap brand and sell them for $50. Then they would brand some of them Old Navy and sell them for $15. It was all the same pants. It just depended on which name they put on it and how much they sold it for. So sometimes those cheap pants you buy are just as good as the expensive pants that someone's buying. Okay, that aside though. Sears. It's interesting, I use this. Sears bought Kmart and they merged together to form this. And as far as I know, this is why I really need to update my slideshow, they're both gone now. Kmart was struggling and Sears purchased them to try to save them, and now I guess even Sears is bellied up. However, let's pretend that was 2016. Oh wow, who knew? Sears owns Kmart. Google. What does Google own? Well, let's just have a look. Google owns all these things. And we could probably even merge some more stuff in here now because this graphic here is a couple of years old. A lot of the stuff I don't even remember anymore, like Waze, and I guess that's an app to use for directions. So all of these little apps and things here are owned by Google, and we could probably add much, much more to it now. Here's one of my favorites, PepsiCo. You clever people will figure out that the root word here is Pepsi. What all does Pepsi own? Well, here you go. Take a look at this. The Pepsi company owns all of these things. Everything from Gatorade, Quaker Oats, Fritos, Doritos, Dole Juices, Tropicana, AMP, all these owned by the same people. So Pepsi has really cornered the market here on snacks and junk food. Yum Brands, which I'm sure you've heard of because of the Yum Center, which is in Louisville. Here are the different things that Yum Brand owns. Yum Brands own KFC, they own Pizza Hut, they own Taco Bell. And you may have noticed sometimes you'll see a pairing of these two stores in one building. For example, down around Cannonsburg in Boyd County, there is a KFC and Taco Bell under the same roof, because they're all owned by the same company. And at one point, I think Pepsi owned them. And if you notice all of these stores, I think the only beverage you can buy there is Pepsi. They don't sell Coke in any of these because they used to all belong together. So Yum Brands owns all these things. Other examples of horizontal integration. The company Comcast owns NBC, Universal, and Focus Features. News Corp owns Fox, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post. Disney owns ABC, ESPN, and Pixar. Viacom owns MTV, Nickelodeon, and Paramount. Time Warner owns CNN, HBO, and Time Magazine. And CBS owns CBS, Showtime, and the Smithsonian Channel. And once again, this graphic is a couple of years old. I'm sure these may have switched some more. You can find some even more interesting horizontal integration. All right, let's look at the other side of it. Vertical integration. So for those of you who are visual, we're talking this way now. Horizontal this way, vertical this way. In economics, vertical integration is when a company expands its operations into each step of the production of a good. Now let's think about it. If you're producing a good, there's a lot of different steps that go all the way from taking the raw material out of the ground, which is primary sector, to turning that into a good, which is secondary sector, and then actually selling it at a retail store, which is the tertiary sector. So as companies start to own all three of those under one roof, that's what we're talking about with vertical integration. They own the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors of production. And if you can afford to do that, it's very beneficial for a company to do that because you control your own destiny. You control your own supply lines. Here's some examples. Let's look at a guy named Andrew Carnegie. You may recognize the name Carnegie from the Carnegie Halls or Carnegie Libraries. Carnegie was a person who owned coal and iron mines. And guys, that even stretches down here to the Appalachian area in eastern Kentucky. He owned coal mines here in eastern Kentucky. He also owned the methods of transporting the raw materials. He built railroads, he owned ships, he owned steel mills. So if we look, Andrew Carnegie had everything going for him. He owned the coal mines where he took iron, ore, and coal. He owned the method of transportation to get it from all these areas, and basically he was bringing it all back to Pittsburgh because that's where he had his steel mills at, and finally he would produce that into steel. So Andrew Carnegie becomes just super, super wealthy because he owned all the means of production. He owned every step of it. Let's look at Cargill. You may have seen this somewhere before. Cargill will sell seeds for farmers, and we're talking about farmers who plant thousands of acres of corn. So they will buy their seed from Cargill and produce corn. And then Cargill also will own these feedlots. I was traveling out through West Texas one time and I came up on one of these feedlots. And it's just pretty much cows all crammed in together for as far as you can see. And we were driving through in the summer and you can imagine it wasn't a very pleasant smell. And Cargill also owns meat packing plants. So if we think about meat production, Cargill has it covered from the get-go. They produce the seeds, which produces the corn. They own the feedlots where we fatten these cows up, and then they also own the processing houses where the cattle are slaughtered and made into edible cuts of beef, which once again here in these Corona days, a little bit of concern about what's going on with the meat industry. There may be some shortages. So when we look at the differences here, vertical integration means that you're owning everything from the cattle, the slaughterhouse, the railroad cars that haul it, the warehouses, and the meat packing plants, and then maybe even sell it at a factory you own, or I'm sorry, a store. Horizontal integration just means that, let's say an oil company buys up different oil companies. So there's your two different types of integration. This leads to something called trusts. A trust is created when a larger company acquires ownership of its competitors to create this super company. All the control of the company and stock are given to a single board of directors, and this creates what we probably understand as a monopoly. And even though we haven't talked much about monopolies in here, hopefully you have an understanding of what that is. It's whenever the seller of a particular service owns all the places you can go to buy that service. So they control every market share. That's a monopoly. You may think monopoly is this little guy right here, but if you play that game, you think about it, that's what you're trying to do. You try to get all the same colored hotels so you can put a bunch of, pieces of property so you can put hotels on it and get lots of money. You want to own all the railroads. You want to own all the utility companies. You're trying to get a monopoly on things. So it's when one company controls all or most of the market shares of a good or service. Let's use Louisiana gas stations, for example. If one person owned every gas station in Lawrence County, they could set the price of gasoline wherever they wanted. Now, if it was super high, you and I would probably travel to surrounding counties to buy gas. But if it's just a little bit higher, we're probably going to pay it. One of the largest trusts, and maybe the largest trust ever, was Standard Oil of New York. John D. Rockefeller, who owned Standard Oil, controlled 90% of all of the oil production in 1900. Let that roll around your head for a second. 90% of all oil produced in this country was controlled by one person, John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil. Here's a nice little graphic just basically showing that the tentacles of the Standard Oil Company pretty much controlled everything in the United States, everything from Washington, D.C. to who knows what. So this made him a very powerful and wealthy man. In fact, he becomes the world's first billionaire in 1916. Think about that. In 1916, John D. Rockefeller is a billionaire. I mean, it's a big deal to be a billionaire now, and he's a billionaire 100 years ago. His net worth in 1937 was $1.4 billion. If we were to transfer that into today's money, that means he would have about $336 billion in today's money. And once again, my numbers here are a couple of years old. It may be even more than that now. So here he is, John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the world, really. And you may say, well, he only had $1.4 billion. Guys, once again, that was in 1937. If you put that on a graph to see how his wealth stacks up to everyone else's wealth in modern times, this is what it looks like. Warren Buffett's worth $64 billion. Sam Walton was worth $65. That's the guy who started Walmart. Carlos Slim, which I think he has something to do with Mexican telecommunications, $75 billion. And then Bill Gates at $101 billion. And then up here's John Rockefeller. His money would have been worth $336 billion now. So clearly this is the richest guy ever. And he got rich because he controlled 90% of the oil production. He had a monopoly or a trust. Now, if you are a business person, that's good for you because you're going to make lots of money. Consumers do not like monopolies or trusts. So what we see happen is citizens and the government got fed up with Rockefeller having so much money. So Teddy Roosevelt used a law that was passed by Congress called the Sherman Antitrust Act to force Rockefeller to break up his monopoly. So Standard Oil was busted down into 33 separate companies. Teddy Roosevelt gets a reputation as the trust buster because he dissolved 44 monopolies while he was in office. And keep in mind, Teddy's in office the early 1900s, and all these giant corporations like Carnegie and Vanderbilt, and I shouldn't say all these, if you've looked them up, we call them captains of industry because these are people who become very, very wealthy because they own these gigantic corporations. So there's our good hunting man, Teddy Roosevelt, bagging some bad trusts. And remember, Teddy always said, speak softly and carry a big stick, and here he is knocking out all these trusts with the big stick. So we'll knock it off here. What we see is there's two types of integration, vertical and horizontal, and this vertical integration and horizontal integration sometimes led to these monopolies and trust, which the public didn't view as being very favorable because they weren't the consumers. So we see the government start to knock them down. You know, within my lifetime, I've seen this happen to Bill Gates at Microsoft. The government stepped in, I don't know, it's probably been 20 years ago, and told Bill Gates he had a monopoly on software because every new computer you bought had his operating systems on it, Windows. And the government made them sort of bust that up. I never really agreed with that, but they didn't ask me what I thought. We're going to stop it right here. Hopefully we'll be back tomorrow with even more. It's just a fantastic journey into economics.